any strategy to dismantle the scam compounds also is going to have to engage Chinese policy interests, not just the Thai or the US ones.
Hello and welcome to episode 49 of What's Happening in Myanmar, a weekly show from the Frontier in Myanmar podcast family. I'm your host, Luke Corbin. It's Sunday, October 19. I apologise for the slight delay with this episode. I had a tooth pulled out this week and we also had some scheduling issues, but I'm delighted to say that today we do have a really interesting chat on the latest developments in the scam industry with expert Jacob Sims. He's currently visiting fellow at Harvard University's Asia Centre, where he works on issues related to transnational crime and human rights in Southeast Asia. But first, some other important updates this week. We'll start with the elections and then move on to conflict. We now have an official locked-in campaign period for the military's planned elections. The regime announced on Thursday that political parties contesting the election will be given 60 days to campaign from October 28. Meanwhile, complaints about voter list errors from political parties joining the elections continued this week. Even candidates up for election themselves have been found absent as voters in the lists. The huge number of complaints by parties that are firmly aligned with the military and its attempts at elections underscores just how problematic they are shaping up to be. If you recall, Hla Sui, the chair of the military proxy Union Solidarity and Development Party, or USDP, the Naypyidaw chapter of that party, he was even detained by military authorities after complaining about the voter lists. Malaysia's foreign ministry has announced that members of ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, will discuss the regime's election during the bloc's summit in Kuala Lumpur in a week's time. Malaysia Foreign Minister Muhammad Hassan further stated on Monday that ASEAN will collectively decide whether to send election observers, stressing that no ASEAN country will unilaterally do so. He said the poll must be conducted in a, quote, free, fair, transparent and credible manner, unquote, and that it must include all political parties and stakeholders, which, if you've been listening to this show, you will know simply isn't going to happen. As covered in Frontier's latest Political Insider newsletter and in last week's podcast interview with election experts, ASEAN is unlikely to reach a consensus on whether to formally endorse the elections because of its internal divisions, and this will likely extend to it not sending observers. This debunks the military regime's claim last week that Malaysia would be sending observers, which was met by much skepticism at the time. And as noted in Frontier's Thursday media monitoring newsletter sent to members, the People's Republic of China's Special Envoy for Asian Affairs, Deng Xijun, again reiterated China's support for the elections this week. Speaking at the 10th anniversary of the ill-fated nationwide ceasefire agreement, the NCA, event in Naypyidaw, Xijun said on Wednesday that China is ready to provide material and technological support for the polls. During the NCA event, coup leader Senior General Min Aung Hlaing repeated that the military elections would not be nationwide, but said that by-elections would be held in the constituencies that missed out at some later date. One assumes that would be predicated on further military successes, of course. And quickly in conflict news, the Arakan Army, the AA, has taken control of the Nat Yay Kan Tactical Command Post in Mugue's Ngapir Township after cutting off access for road reinforcements to the base last week. The offensive to capture Nat Yay Kan has been ongoing for 7 months. The base is on the road connecting An to Padan. It's a critical route used by the military regime to send troops into Rakhine State. The AA could use the base to launch incursions deeper into central Myanmar, putting it within striking distance of key munitions factories in the region. The AA, in fact, increasingly threatens the military-industrial complex in the lowlands east of the Rakhine mountain range, and it captured another 2 military outposts in Bago Region's Badown Township this week, one of which is quite near to the military's defence industry factory number 16. Then on early Thursday morning, the Chinland Defence Force Hakha, the CDF Hakha, and its allies attacked the central police station in the Chin state capital, freeing 15 detainees, according to the Chin National Army. The CDF Hakha also attacked the same police station in July last year and freed 62 detainees at that time. This is a clear reminder of the fact that while the Myanmar military still controls Hakha, nearly the entire of the rest of Chin state is in the hands of different Chin resistance forces, which, however, are still bickering amongst themselves. You can hear more about that on episodes 18 and 20 of this show from earlier in the year. And finally, the military's cascade of victories against the Ta'ang National Liberation Army in northern Shan State, that's the TNLA, well, it continued this week with the fall of Hsipaw, which was taken by the TNLA 1 year ago. Like with their defeat in Jalpmer earlier this month, administration buildings were set alight as the TNLA retreated. Taking control of Hsipaw extends the military's domination of the highway connecting Mandalay to the Chinese border at Muse, a key objective. Fierce fighting is also threatening the TNLA-held ruby mining hub of Mogok to the west. The Air Force continued hitting TNLA-held areas with bombs right throughout this week. And to round out the conflict news, I'll point out that on first count, the Myanmar Air Force has killed at least 10 civilians, including 7 children, and injured over 60 since this podcast's last episode. As usual, the bombs landed on schools, homes, and shops in residential neighborhoods, and a monastery. Did you know that Frontier has another podcast? It's called Do Atan, which means Our Voice, and it's a bilingual show that's focused on human rights issues in Myanmar. This week's new episode is about women in central Myanmar struggling with low wages, a high gender pay gap, and with the fact that ongoing conflict puts them at risk when travelling outside of their villages to find work. Check it out on the Frontier website and on all the good podcast apps. Now, long-time listeners may remember episode 15 from February this year, when the economist's Su-Lin Wong explained to us the significance of the global scam industry and how Myanmar fits into it. At that time, pressure from the Chinese and Thailand governments was increasing on the Karen State Border Guard Force, the BGF, and the many scam operations in Myawaddy Township in particular. Thailand restricted electricity and fuel supplies, and thousands of foreign citizens coerced into working in the scam compounds were repatriated to their many different homelands. But since then, the scam industry in Myanmar has barely taken a backward step. Following his new opinion piece published in Frontier Myanmar this week, Jacob Sims, visiting fellow at Harvard University's Asia Centre, joins us now to talk about human trafficking and the state in Myanmar, as well as the developments, or lack of them, in Myanmar's scam industry this year. Jacob's piece is called Two Paths to the Bottom, When States Become Sponsors of Human Trafficking, and the link is in the show notes. Hello, Jacob. Welcome to What's Happening in Myanmar.
Thanks for having me.
So let's start with your recent piece in Frontier Myanmar about the human trafficking report and then move on to some updates on the scam industry. Your piece was in response to the delayed United States Trafficking in Persons report that was finally released last month. In the report, it says, not for the first time, that the state in Myanmar actively sponsors human trafficking. And this year, Cambodia was also fingered by the report. Maybe a good way to get into talking about the report is this notion of the state. You know, people might think that the military in Myanmar is hardly in control of the whole country. Neither are the resistance groups. So what does the report mean when it's saying that the state is sponsoring human trafficking?
Right. I mean, first of all, when I'm responding to this report, I'm trying to respond to the way that the report writers wrote it, and they are meaning the illegitimate military regime. They aren't speaking about the armed ethnic groups and their work. They're talking about the body that has claimed sovereignty, whether or not they've secured it, they've claimed it, and so they're being held culpable for that claim. And when they designate them as a tier 3 country, meaning did not meet the minimum criteria for their commitments to counter human trafficking, and then this additional award or title of a state sponsor of human trafficking. And what that means, and I discussed this in the piece, The Tier 3 designation is a designation of demonstrated fulfillment of commitments about human trafficking. So it's looking at the results of the government's efforts. This additional label of whether or not a country can be considered an evidenced state sponsor of trafficking is talking less about the results than the underlying incentives and what the State Department calls policies and patterns in support of human trafficking. And so where they think that there is sufficient evidence of a system-wide incentive that is driving towards human trafficking and facilitating it and perpetuating it as a matter of course, that's where that designation comes in. So it's less about the results achieved or the commitment demonstrated and more about, do we actually think that this regime thinks that they are benefiting more from the status quo than a reform scenario?
Okay, that's clear. And this report actually pointed out that Myanmar was a state sponsor of human trafficking before the coup and a return to military rule in 2020, in fact.
So yeah, that's correct. So the TVPA, which is the Trafficking Victims Protection Act that enacted the TIP report, far predates the designation type of state sponsor of trafficking, and they actually just introduced that through an amendment to the statute in 2020. And from that very first year in 2020, preceding the coup, and then moving all the way through, and then this year, Myanmar is one of 8 countries that has maintained that designation in all of those years. And my memory is that the 2020 designation actually had to do with predominantly what was happening in Rakhine. The Rohingya situation was the primary driver in 2020. You could say policies and patterns evidenced that the government was involved in an array of rights abuses, trafficking being one of them. But then post-coup, if you start reading the more recent reports, the State Department alleges increasing evidence of an accelerating trend towards not that just happening in one province against one ethnic group, but actually it being a dominant mode by which the SAC has perpetrated their war against their people in the country. So whether that is this sort of atrocity demining, so like these are forced laborers that are forced to walk in front of military troops, forced labor for porters, whether it's the use of the prolific use of sexual violence and sex trafficking as a mode of terrorizing people in the perpetuation of the war, or whether it is these scam compounds where there are SAC linkages and ownership trees, and certainly say beneficial ownership trees. So there's basically moved from a more isolated, demonstrated policy and pattern of state involvement to something that is accelerated and become much more widespread.
Okay, and you write that the correct response to this report is to demand structural remedies. So what can be done in Myanmar to combat the scourge of human trafficking and the scam industry? Of course, trafficking is bigger than the scam industry, but we'll talk about that next, so maybe start there.
Yeah, so structural remedies would include cutting off the money, finding ways to shut down the locations and venues that are sponsoring this, to hold the criminally culpable actors accountable. And so first and foremost, that means targeting the military and the militia political economy. So whether that's expanding sanctions, linking the counter-trafficking to counterinsurgency financing, whether it's integrating financial sanctions with arms embargoes, it could be a lot of those things. It also has to do with starving that ecosystem's different financial arteries. So there are Treasury, it's called the Section 311 authorities that designate key payment processors and crypto exchanges that are servicing those border scams as primary money laundering concerns. This could be mandating some level of on-chain analytics cooperation between the stablecoin issuers and U.S. law enforcement. It could be engaging with Thai and Singaporean banks to monitor suspicious cross-border remittances spikes. There's a lot of things that you could be doing to cut off some of the financial arteries to the regime that is allowing them to continue to fund both a very costly war, but also specifically in this case, the atrocity of human trafficking. So, I mean, I guess those are some of what I mean by structural changes.
Thanks, Jacob. I've got it. At a broader level, this United States Trafficking in Persons report is just the latest in a long line of reports pointing out what a huge problem human trafficking is in military-ruled Myanmar. You say that this most recent one, it really cuts through the polite parlance. It calls on concerned governments to confront what evidence clearly shows. But there was always a chance that this United States report might not be so damning and evidence-based, especially with the unconstrained Trump administration in power. So I want to ask you just how political these reports are, and is their importance or their influence diminishing as the United States' role in the world changes?
Yeah, I mean, it's a terrific question, and I think it's sort of, the answer is sort of, it remains to be seen. I mean, certainly you saw a dramatic shift in the posture of certain countries in the State Department's annual human rights report. Some key countries saw major shifts. I think that was also the case in certain regions or parts of the world with the TIP report. But I think by and large, if you speak to civil society actors and experts on the region, I mean, this report looks largely in alignment in our region, in the Mekong sub-region, with how past reports looked, with some added, you quoted the report, the op-ed of there's more candor. There's a bit through of this, like cutting through hyper sanitized diplomatic parlance. And my meaning by that is that's mostly directed at Cambodia, where there is this delusion that the state, which is widely evidenced as a perpetrator of human trafficking, can be looked to in good faith as a partner in that fight. And that's what effectively what this state sponsor label does, is it clarifies that these countries, by the perspective of the U.S. government, should not be considered partners in the fight against human trafficking. And that probably isn't a very radical position to take in Myanmar at this point, because I think most people who are operating recognize that the SAC probably isn't a good partner in the fight against human trafficking, or in many other activities as well. But that understanding and frame and starting point is a pretty serious departure in Cambodia, where effectively some combination of factors, some of this like hyper-sanitized language, but a lot just the regime there being quite good at sort of pulling the wool over the eyes of the international community, using combination of repression, propaganda, disinformation, has been very successful at continuing to perpetuate this mirage of partnership that I think this report does a really good job, cutting through some of that. But then in terms of like how effective this report is going to be, how neutral it's going to be into the future, there was a big delay. There was definitely a lot of speculation about like, or is trafficking going to somehow get conflated with tariff negotiations or trade negotiations? It doesn't really appear that happened. A lot of the things that external observers were hoping would happen or were thinking should happen based on the evidence generally did. Now, that said, not just this year, but in all preceding years, there is some element, certainly some skepticism about the report as both an instrument, a policy instrument to talk about in a neutral way human trafficking, but also to push U.S. geopolitical, sort of America strategic objectives. And as those strategic objectives shift, I think it is natural that we will see some of the content of the report shift over time, to the degree to which the report is like tied up and compromised in some of those factors. So,
thank you for your candor on that question, Jacob. Now, pivoting to the scam industry, a lot of attention is paid to the scam industry when it comes to human trafficking, because of course there's these high-profile instances of trafficking of foreign citizens into Myanmar, into these scam compounds. And earlier this year, there was a much publicized crackdown, quite a lot of attention paid to the cooperation between China, Thailand, to some extent, the Myanmar military and border militias. There were thousands of repatriations. I think, around 7,000 people were repatriated. During this crackdown this year, Thailand cut electricity supply to Myawaddy, many of these compounds. But when they did so, these compounds switched to using generators. Thailand also cut mobile connections, internet, to these compounds. When they did so, the compounds switched to using Starlink. Not to mention that construction in these militia-controlled areas in Myawaddy and Three Pagodas Pass has continued this year. So can we now say definitively that the crackdown of 2025 has failed? And if so, but surely these repatriations have at least been an unqualified good thing.
Yeah, so first of all, I would say that yes, in general, repatriation could be seen as the inverse of trafficking, but there's some nuance there. All of the Chinese nationals that were pulled out of those compounds, I think the number is somewhere around 2,000 people. I would not consider these repatriations. These were forcible deportations, where they did not follow a formal repatriation process, but they followed this informal parallel process between some combination of the BGF or KNA, the Thai government, and the Chinese government. And I would refer to these as like black bag deportations, like put a black bag over their head, send them back home. And what we know about the scam industry is that when proper victim identification is done, somewhere it always ranges, but like somewhere between 80 and 90, and sometimes upward of over 90% of those people end up having a very good case to be potential victims of trafficking. But of those 2,000 people, thus far, there's no information to say that any of those people have been classified as anything but criminals. And so certainly they're not in a situation of trafficking anymore, but they are forced criminals who have now been criminalized by their government. I want to just say, like, even the release of the people itself has not been like an unmitigated good. There were 7,000 people that were removed and eventually repatriated and made it back home, and that is really good. Like, this is, one of the largest single instances of human trafficking victims removed from that situation and then, made their way back home safely ever. It's an almost like unprecedented scale of a human trafficking rescue. But I think when we look at this and like the macro implications of this on the scam industry and the likelihood that it's going to continue trafficking people, I don't even think we can call this a crackdown. This was much more a set of negotiations between the KNA and the compounds that the KNA has clear financial ties to. And so like clearly there was pressure from China and pressure from Thailand, with pressure from China behind that, that led to pressure being asserted on the militia groups to get people out. But these were not, in no way can we look at this as the compounds themselves and the key high-level criminals being dismantled or even put under real pressure other than to give up a certain number of people so that it would look like a serious, like, quote unquote crackdown. And this that actually follows quite in parallel to the Cambodian government's quote unquote crackdowns or performative crackdowns and raids that have basically been designed to alleviate international pressure over the years. But those types of crackdowns, or even more serious crackdowns without system change, is just going to lead to displacement. It's not going to lead to elimination. And that's exactly what we've seen. We've seen a period of quiet, a period of caution as folks wait for the waters to calm. And then, the lights turn on at many of these compounds again, and then consistent expansion further and further south. There's compounds all the way down as far as Three Pagodas Pass. And so like that vulnerability to crackdowns, which now does exist on some level in Myawaddy, has at best, we can say, displaced the issue further south.
Okay, and you brought up Cambodia again. There's been a really big development there. The United States government has seized more than $14 billion in Bitcoin and also charged Chen Zhi, the founder of Cambodian conglomerate Prince Holding Group. It's charged him over an alleged massive cryptocurrency scam. According to the indictment, Prince Holding Group built at least 10 scam compounds in Cambodia. So, how significant was this seizure? What are the details? And is freezing funds like this a much more impactful way for Western governments to combat the scam problem, rather than just sanctioning crime bosses alone? What are the limitations to this approach? It can't be easy to follow the money. And are the limitations purely technological or political as well? Thanks.
Yeah, a great question. So first of all, a few things happened. Yes, the indictment and the seizure happened. Also, for the first time in this space, it was not just the U.S. government, but the U.S. and the U.K. did bilateral joint sanctions. So there's a Treasury and an FCDO joint sanction that actually resulted in, I think it was $179 million in UK property also being seized and frozen from Chen Zhi. And so that's actually something that I've written quite a lot about, that unilateral sanctions are a great way to do this sort of like structural disruption. But when you start doing sanctions in tandem, or, better, like coalitionally, like what if this was the US, the UK, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and other concerned countries where these kleptocratic elite are storing their assets? That is really effective. That in of itself is a groundbreaking moment for this space, and $179 million in UK property is already material. That's already significant. But then the evidentiary threshold for sanction is much lower, actually, than the benchmark for an indictment. And so in this sense, like the US has raised the volume on Chen Zhi specifically through this indictment. And when you read the indictment, I think this is another thing that is very significant. You read that indictment, it is very clear this is not a rogue criminal actor. Formally, Chen Zhi was a Cambodian citizen. He purchased citizenship, almost around 10 years ago, and actually serves as a senior government official in the Cambodian government. He was a cabinet-level advisor to both Hun Sen, the former prime minister, and his son, Hun Manet, the current prime minister. And you read the indictment, and it is chock full of this language about Chen Zhi's co-conspirator number 2, a foreign government official to whom he gave tens of millions of dollars, or a dozen Rolexes, or a yacht. And when you read the fine print of how the indictment flows, it looks very convincing that like many of these co-conspirators were certainly hyper senior members of the Cambodian government. And so it is significant in that a combination of this state trafficking designation and now this sanction indictment and massive asset seizure is implicating not only one rogue criminal actor, but the entire state structure that was clearly supporting him and being supported. That is the maybe like most critical part, was being supported by his criminal activities. That $15 billion, which like that maybe is the most significant part of this whole thing, because historically, it is completely unprecedented. 14, almost $15 billion is by a significant margin the largest criminal asset seizure in history. The money that Chen Zhi made, knowing that he was this deeply state-embedded actor, much of that money actually was probably money he was using to continue paying for the loyalty and reliable support of the Cambodian ruling elite and the institutions that sit under their control. And so, in a very real way, like this is part of the governing strategy of that regime over the last 40 years, is the use of highly criminalized elite patronage systems, of which Chen Zhi is potentially one of the top patrons of all time. And so there's actually very, very significant damage that has been done to a very malign form of government in the region. But I think the ultimate answer to the question of how significant is this is the answer to the follow-on question is, will concerned governments around the world continue to keep the pedal down? Like, will they continue to keep the pressure on? Because Chen Zhi is not an anomaly here. Like across Myanmar, across Laos, across Cambodia, there are dozens, if not hundreds, of other people who are operating similarly, having co-opted local elites, potentially being collaborators with foreign governments who are attempting to assert influence over these Mekong Southeast Asia countries, and also just perpetuating an enormous amount of evidenced crime in these countries and around the world. This could be very, very disruptive to the status quo right now of the existence of an emergence of additional state actors who are perpetuating their regime durability on the back of scams. If the world says, just like we say that genocide and terrorism are not effective ways to maintain grips on power, scams against the rest of the world using human trafficking labor, if the world stands up and says that, this could be a very serious inflection point in the future of this crime.
Right, and there's also pressure developing from different aspects of the harms that are caused by scam compounds. So in August this year, the organization International Justice Mission released a study that cross-referenced millions of cybercrime reports with IP addresses that are known to be used at Southeast Asia scam compounds. It found that nearly 500 child sexual exploitation reports were connected to 40 separate scam compounds in Southeast Asia, and nearly 20,000, I think 18,000 reports were implicated with these IP addresses, so they're potentially associated with the scam compounds. Is that a surprise to you? You know, this kind of harm is much more morally repugnant than financial crime and easier to sort of understand. So could this increase Western or Chinese pressure on combating the scam industry? If more focus is put on this side of the harm generated by this organized crime.
So first of all, yes, like you said, financial crime is a complex thing, and it's harder to get your head around than drug trafficking or illegal mining or illegal deforestation or some of the other forms of crime. And so in my view, it has been, from like an advocacy standpoint, a real gift in the fight against it. This particular form of financial crime, the melding of these two worlds of the counter trafficking people with the counter fraud and the counter scam people has created I think one of the most unique and dynamic grassroots advocacy movements that's happening right now. And I think with the advent of this, I mean, this IJM report that came out, you've basically added a third bubble into that Venn diagram, where you now there is a massive grassroots movement trying to stop the scourge of sextortion, particularly child sextortion, which is this really pernicious, evil industry that is targeting children all over the world. And seeing that, the intersection points of, you have human trafficking victims in scam compounds that we know are targeting people from around the world at an enormous scale, that are also doing industrial scale, potentially, sextortion activities. And so you combine the child protection world and the human trafficking world and the anti-scam world, and you have potentially this massive groundswell of constituent interest in a major foreign policy issue also. The fact that it has political salience is, maybe a fourth bubble into that Venn diagram. And there's this huge moment that we're in right now where we have the potential to use this crisis to push for change, that ultimately all of this stuff happens because of profound deficits in governance and in states that have completely abdicated their duty to care for the people who live within those jurisdictions. And you have this massive potential movement that could motivate powerful governments around the world to push back against some of these really malign trends.
That's good to hear. Let's hope that happens. That there's another angle that I need to bring up here, I think, before finishing, Jacob, which is a little bit counter, or it augments the whole human trafficking perspective. Local media organization Hsipaw released a story this week. It was reported that on October 16, more than 600 people who were previously involved in the online scam industry in northern Shan State were released from police custody in Muse. Now, they were arrested last year after China exerted pressure for a crackdown on the cyber scam operations there. It's important to note that Muse is controlled by the military regime. These 600 people were apparently mostly women, and they mostly lived in villages around Muse. What this highlights is, you mentioned before that, around 90% of the people in the compounds doing the scamming have a good case for being trafficked in, but it remains a fact that you also have thousands of local Myanmar people with very few options for income generation, given the civil war, the revolution against military rule, voluntarily working in these scam compounds. Not necessarily scamming. There's all kinds of other jobs in there. So there is some concern that this scam industry is, from the perspective of the well-being of local people, it's too big to fail. This suggests that alternative jobs are going to be needed if the compounds are ever to be truly stopped, if they are to stop scamming, that is. The parallel that comes to mind is the decades-old efforts to stop warlords and elites in eastern Myanmar from fostering opium agriculture and refining heroin. This again points to the overall political economy in which the scam industry exists in Myanmar: conscription, war, poverty, all pushing people into vulnerable situations. So is this kind of perspective a helpful one to take, maybe particularly by neighbours like Thailand, who, they were an important partner in international efforts to transform the opium industry with crop substitution and stuff like that in the past?
Yeah, well, first of all, yes, there is the real reality that more so in Myanmar than in Cambodia, that local people are beginning to work in these compounds at some scale. It's hard to say exactly at what scale that's happening and what percentage of the estimated 100 to 150,000 people caught up in this space in Myanmar are foreign versus domestic. I think most people would probably say it's still mostly foreign workers that populate this, like in terms of scale. But it's a totally legitimate question that, wait, actually in a conflict economy, local people are going to be doing whatever they possibly can to make money because a lot of those traditional economic opportunities are gone. In my view, that has much more to do with, okay, we need to look at the structural factors that are supporting and perpetuating the conflict. And instead of does this industry itself actually serve some good? Because it's actually, in any way you look at it, this is a bad industry, sort of similar to opium. I think my point though is I think before some sort of economic substitute program, I would be looking at how do we reduce the incentives that are driving the perpetuation of the conflict. And I think this is one thing we haven't talked about, but China's strategic shift in their relationship to Myanmar's military really, really matters. And it matters to this space, and it matters to the economic incentives that are driving people into the compounds as well. So they actually shifted from back in 2023. You could say China was doing selective but rather significant coercive pressure that actually disrupted this industry and led to significant territorial loss by the military. And they've shifted more towards selective cooperation with the military. That move in and of itself has given the scam center ecosystem more breathing space. So the border hubs here are not just criminal fringe zones. They're actually tied into the broader political economic relationship between Beijing and Naypyidaw. And that means that any strategy to dismantle the scam compounds also is going to have to engage Chinese policy interests, not just the Thai or the US ones.
Yeah, you're right there, Jacob. It's a good reminder that China's influence, interference in Myanmar's domestic affairs, and support for the Myanmar military does affect the scam industry as much as anything else. Now, the last question to wrap it up. You have your finger clearly on the pulse of this issue, especially when it comes to the international dimension, the legal side, the advocacy side. So what do you see the priorities, the likely actions to come in 2026? What's the future of the scam industry?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot has to do with what happens from here. Like we talked about earlier, I think this Chen Zhi sanction indictment and seizure has the potential to be an inflection point, certainly in Cambodia, but also in terms of how the world looks at potentially efficacious responses to the issue in other countries as well. But a lot of that has to do, again, with a willingness to keep the pressure on. It has to do with a willingness to look at these regimes with clear eyes and to look at their allies and the people that are supporting them and the countries that are supporting them with clear eyes and look for ways to disincentivize engagement in this globally harmful activity. And I don't want to prophesy what's going to happen in Myanmar, but I think making progress on this issue, which then will make progress on governance issues in both countries more broadly in a sort of rising tides lift all ships way, just given the economic and political centrality of this issue. A lot of that has to do with finding ways to cut off the money to disincentivize the trafficking itself, to hold the principally culpable actors accountable. And we're showing greater creativity and resolve in doing that. But that's going to just, that level of pressure that we saw this week in this historic moment in Cambodia is going to have to broaden and continue on if we're going to want to see that trajectory continue.
Jacob Sims, thanks for your expertise on what's happening in the scam industry.
Thanks so much for your time. I'm excited to hear the episode.
Jacob's opinion piece we've been talking about today is not the only new article on the Frontier website this week. You can jump online right now and check out the fresh content, including an original piece by Victor Maung on the ongoing fallout from the United States visa ban on most Myanmar citizens. And remember, you can join Frontier as a member if you aren't already. The price is fair and you'll get access to everything you need to stay on top of what's really happening in Myanmar. Daily briefing newsletters, media monitoring, political analysis, and exclusive online and offline events. Your support for independent Myanmar media means the world to us, to Frontier Myanmar's journalists, and to our colleagues at other media organisations fighting the good fight to report from a fraught information environment. Thanks for listening, and until next week, farewell and take care.